All right, I think we'll get started. Hello, everyone. My name is Olka Joshi Hansen. I'm Chief Program Officer here at Grantmakers for Education. Appreciate you taking time to be with us today for this webinar on emergency student aid, how post-secondary leaders scaled for impact in a time of urgent need. This program is being sponsored in partnership with one of our impact groups, our Postsecondary Access and Attainment Impact Group. These groups are an opportunity for funders who work in the same area and have shared interests to learn together with each other, and we appreciate them making this program available to our wider membership since it's just a really intriguing and important issue. So I'm going to hand it over to Sue Shui, who's Senior Program Officer of Education Philanthropy at the Ascendium Education Group. She's also one of the co-chairs for our PSA2 group. Thank you, Sue.
Thanks, Olka. On behalf of my co-chair, Leslie Garula, who is the Director of Programs and Strategy at Greater Texas Foundation, I'm happy to welcome you to a PSA2 learning event. PSA2, as Olka mentioned, is the shorthand for ourselves as funders working to advance post-secondary access and attainment. We seek to complement GFE programming throughout the year through networking events and learning sessions. You may have seen one of our newsletters that come out monthly-ish. If you're a higher ed funder looking to get the most out of your GFE membership and to engage more deeply with your peers, please get in touch with us. This session is brought to you by two of our steering committee members, Blake Pickett and Tina Gridiron. Many thanks to you, Blake and Tina, for your service to our funding community.
Thank you, Sue and Tina, and welcome to everyone joining us this afternoon. We are so happy that you're here, and we're looking forward to this discussion. My name is Blake Pickett. I am the Senior Program Officer with the James Graham Brown Foundation in Louisville, Kentucky. And before I get started with my part, I just want to thank Sue again and the rest of my colleagues on the PSA2 Steering Committee, and in particular Tina, for her help organizing this session. Tina, I'm just grateful to have had the opportunity to work with you, so thank you. Okay, so I know we're eager to hear from our panelists and get into a rich discussion about emergency student aid and what we've learned over the last few years from efforts to scale this form of aid rapidly. So our goals for today are to highlight some promising emergency aid efforts that are happening at scale, to share lessons learned both from research and institutional practice, to unpack the realities and impact of the pandemic on emergency aid efforts, and to outline funder strategies and activities designed to strengthen and enhance the work. So here's the way this is going to work. In just a second, I'll introduce the panelists, and they'll each start by sharing some opening remarks about their work. Following that, Tina's going to facilitate a question and answer session, after which we'll invite the panelists to make some concluding remarks and recommendations. So a couple things to keep in mind. If you do have questions for the panelists, please put them into the Q&A, not the chat. However, as Olka said, we would love for you to use the chat to introduce yourselves by listing your name and the organization you represent. Also, please feel free to use the chat to add any links to information about emergency aid that you'd like to share with the group, whether it's programs, grantees, research, key thought leaders, anything you wish to share with the group. Okay, with that said, it's now my pleasure to introduce you to our three panelists. Getting us started will be May Yen Ireland. May Yen is the Senior Program Officer responsible for strategic investments in holistic advising as part of the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation's Post-Secondary Success strategy. May Yen works with grantees and partners to promote institutional transformation through the redesign of advising and student supports to ensure that more students, particularly Black, Latino, and Indigenous students, and students from low-income backgrounds, obtain quality, affordable credentials, offering value and mobility. Prior to joining the foundation, May Yen was the Executive Director of Holistic Student Supports at Achieving the Dream. Our next panelist is Amelia Parnell. Amelia is Vice President for Research and Policy at NASPA, Student Affairs Administrators in Higher Education, where she leads many of the association's scholarly and advocacy-focused activities. Amelia's policy and practitioner experiences include prior roles in association management, legislative policy analysis, internal audit, and TRIO programs. She writes and speaks frequently about topics related to student affairs, including college affordability, student learning outcomes, leadership in higher education, and institutions' use of data and analytics. And last but certainly not least, we have Anna Drake-Warshaw, who's Managing Director of the University Innovation Alliance, a consortium of public research universities working together to test and scale innovative approaches to improving degree outcomes for low-income students and students of color. Prior to joining the UIA team, Anna worked for the Center for Higher Education Innovation at the University of Central Florida and earned her PhD in Higher Education Leadership and Policy from the University of Texas at Austin. And with that, Mei Yen, the floor is yours.
Great, thank you so much. And I'm delighted to speak with you all about our work in emergency aid. And first, a big thanks to Grantmakers for Education and the PSA2 Impact Group for hosting this session, and particularly to Tina Gridiron for moderating and leading the development of this session. So to start with the first slide, I wanted to just share a little bit about the Bill and Melinda Gates Post-Secondary Success strategy. So if we can go to the next slide, I'll just check that. Great, awesome, thank you very much. So our post-secondary success strategy focuses on ensuring more students, especially Black, Latino, and Indigenous students and students from low-income backgrounds, achieve their educational goals, and that race and ethnicity and income are no longer predictors of student success. And we do this through 4 priorities. The first is around innovation, so innovation in policies and practices that will help students get on the path to a certificate or degree and stay on the path. The second is data and information so that we can better understand what works and what could work better. The third is student first policy at the federal and state level. And then those 3 priorities really culminate into our focus on institutional transformation. So redesigning institutional policies and practices to create more coherent and inclusive learning environments. So on the next slide, you'll see that one of our innovation focus areas is holistic student support. And in this work, we recognize that keeping students on a path to their goals really requires support for the whole student. And so we focus on things like advising and credit transfer, and in this case, emergency aid. So our focus in emergency aid began around 2016, and we were recognizing that financial insecurity represented one of the largest barriers to increasing access and retention and completion. So we focused on exploring post-secondary financial solutions, trying to identify those financial loss and momentum points along a student's journey and explore what those related financial solutions might be. So we wanted to engage with field leaders to understand more deeply the issues, to evaluate kind of the relevance of possible solutions and how we might be able to automate or increase the adoption of those. Now, I should say I cannot take credit for this initial work and strategy. My predecessor, Sarah Bowder, was really the mastermind for this strategy and this kind of early innovation portfolio around emergency aid. She took this scaling approach that I've listed here, and I think it's an important way to think about how and what investments we were making. So the first was for scaling, the importance of defining it. So defining that solution area, doing the research and the landscape analysis. What is emergency aid, the taxonomy, the components of a robust program? Who are the exemplar institutions and emerging institutions out there? The second piece was know it. So really building that field awareness, disseminating the findings from that definition stage, trying to push for a common language and understanding in the field around emergency aid. And this was supported by the key work done by NASPA, which Amelia will talk about in more depth, and their partners, where they were conducting research, bringing together community of practice, developing the Student Arc website, which I hope everyone on this call will visit if you haven't already. So the next component of our scaling approach was called Pilot It. So really working with institutions to pilot emergency aid programs in order to develop and catalog the best practices. Really, what are the use cases, the metrics of success, the return on investment, and taking those learnings into this automate idea around what methods and tools can we use to help enable greater institutional adoption of something like emergency aid programs. We had 2 investments related to piloting and automating. The first was our emergency aid lab work, which was facilitated by Rio's partners. And they used a social lab approach to facilitate a group of institutions through this institutional innovation process in order, again, to kind of determine what were those success factors, the best practices and policies and procedures for emergency aid programs. And then Rio's partners developed an emergency aid roadmap. Again, this idea of automating it into to scale adoption to really help institutions with that high quality implementation of emergency aid. The second investment was to the University Innovation Alliance, and Anna will talk more about this, and it focused on completion grants. So this is a component maybe less widely practiced at that time than emergency aid, but had really clear high efficacy as demonstrated from success from places like Georgia State and their Panther Retention Grant Program. So again, Anna will show more about that work, but as a funder, our goal was to enable UIA campuses to pilot, adopt, and scale their own completion grant programs, and then document their processes and lessons into a set of assets. So in this case, the GRADE completion grants playbook that we have a link for there and that Anna will talk more about. So one note on this, and we can return to this later during the discussion, that I wanted to flag that this was work that was enabled through a really great partnership with Ascendium, and is a good example of co-funding and collaboration on an innovative project. So for example, the Gates Foundation does not generally directly fund grants to students. So Ascendium was able to provide the funding for the scholarships portion of this completion grants project. And then we contributed with funding for the operational kind of programmatic parts of the program. So in sum, I just, one of the reflections I had in preparing for this webinar was that this was a relatively small portfolio in terms of budget and number of investments and duration of our investment in this space. But we saw really high return on our investments in this work. And I think there's some levers for scaling and some critical conditions that enabled that. And we can, again, talk more about that in the Q&A. But the importance of having these amazing partners that you're about to hear from, that strategic approach to really building the case making in the field, the communities of practice, the research is foundational. But then we also benefited from things like the moment in time, where we were in the evolution of the student success movement back in 2016, the role of policy, and then of course the impact of the pandemic. So I look forward to getting more into discussion with you all, but I want to move to kind of really the heart of this webinar today and pass it over to Amelia and then Anna to share more about the important work that they did.
Thanks, Megan. I think you set us up really, really well. So if I could start off, I think our portion of this discussion will definitely flow into a lot of different themes. I know that in 2022, it's 6 years since 2016, but there are a lot of themes from that period that I think still remain pretty true today. And on the next slide, I'll give you what I would say are lessons learned and areas for improvement, challenges that still remain. So if I had to put a headline and swap this one out, I would say that collaboration is essential. I mean, I know that's probably understood, but I would overemphasize the importance of collaboration, both on the campuses that make effective emergency aid programs work, but then also collaborations between organizations and funders and everybody else who's interested in doing the same great work for students. But without that type of collaboration, these types of scale will just honestly not come to fruition. So these effective practices and remaining challenges are really reflective of the investments that Megan mentioned. So back in 2016, NASPA did a landscape analysis of emergency aid programs, and it was really to try to get to those areas around defining it and actually knowing what it is. And one of the biggest challenges were to actually provide a definition of an emergency. Depending on who you're asking, it could be framed in different ways. Depending on who's working on it, it could be regulated in different ways. And so we worked through some of that stuff. But the first, I'd say, effective practice was proactive and open communication about the availability of the aid. If you think back to those early conversations, there were still some campuses, and rightfully so, saying if we promote this too widely, if we market it widely, students may give us an influx of requests for which we don't have resources to actually allocate. And that kind of hindered or hampered a little bit of this idea of strategic communication, making it open and accessible, and even a commonplace thing for someone to say, I'm having an emergency. I think we've worked through that. And I think the effective practice now is we've seen that go much, much further in the opposite direction, even down to campuses putting information about emergency aid in the syllabus. And so I think that's a really, really good marker of success. The second is then back to this collaboration thing. Across multiple campus offices and functions, you'd probably expect that student affairs would probably be involved, maybe academic affairs if a student comes to one of them, but IT and communications department, even the business office, making the business case for why emergency aid should be a dedicated part of any funding strategy for the campus. So those types of collaborations, I think, across multiple campuses and offices actually help the type of work go at a faster pace and greater scale. And then third, obviously, if a student is having an emergency, we can't get back to them, a couple months later. So the smoother and faster delivery of the resources to students, and some of those being financial, it could be a grant, it could be a loan, but then also some immediate support around housing and transportation and other things. I think campuses have become even more efficient at how they do that, and doing it through some systems that are not easily where a student would fall between the cracks, and so they're not so convoluted. So I'd say in the heart of all of these effective practices are a large number of professionals who really want to help. But even in the middle of doing that helping, there are still some remaining challenges. So let's go to the next slide. I'll tell you about those. I should have started with the negative first and done the positive, but Anna, I think we'll bring it up, after this. I don't want to depress everybody, but there are still some challenges. So continued progress will require institutions to address several things. And these things, I wouldn't call them as things that plague us, but things that could truly hamper, again, the progress that we want to make. The first is this narrative about how and why students experience emergencies. I can't tell you the number of professionals I talked with back many years ago that said, is it really an emergency? How do we know? Could they have done more? Maybe they just need a little bit more coaching. Maybe they need a little bit more education and training on how to manage their money. Emergencies can happen to anyone. And I certainly don't want to assert that extra coaching and training on how to handle expected and routine expenses wouldn't help. It certainly would. But I think the shifting in a narrative about how an emergency can happen to anybody might push us into a place where we could probably address that challenge a little bit more efficiently. The second is that there are multiple types of emergency needs, as we know, and they are conflated a little bit. They are actually connected in some ways. So if a student is having a health and wellness related challenge, that could impact their ability to focus in the classroom, which also could impact their ability to manage their other priorities. And so trying to tease out what somewhat referred to as the mental health crisis, also with financial challenges and other things, these types of complexities when it comes to emergencies are hard to describe. And when asking a student to actually come to us and tell us the type of help that they desire, we need to become more savvy in how to shepherd that type of request. And then the last is this varying time frame thing. So I hear a lot of campuses talk about the distinction between the 24-hour emergency and the recurring needs like food insecurity, things like that. So I don't think this helps us get around the larger challenge, which is that college is still expensive. And so for many campuses, there will be a gap in funding the students will need to address. But I think back to the previous slide, we're getting better with our ability to allocate resources in the 24-hour emergency space. I think going forward, trying to address those persistent and plaguing types of emergencies will require a little bit more work later on. So I think I'm right at 5 minutes, and I want to pass the baton to my next teammate.
Hi there. Thank you, Amelia. All right, well, thank you all, and thanks so much to Grantmakers for Education and the organizers. It's really wonderful to be here, and it's really wonderful to have the privilege of sharing a panel with a funding partner from Gates and also with NASPA, who's always a wonderful partner in student success work. So the UIA, we can move to the next slide if you don't mind. For context for where we'll go, is a group of large public research universities committed to working together to share and scale strategies for helping more low-income students and students of color graduate. We were founded in 2014 by a group of 11 presidents and chancellors who recognized that as a country and as a sector, we were failing low-income students and students of color. And as a result of failing those students, we were failing to meet the long-term economic needs of our society. So they realized that this wasn't working, and that working to solve that problem in isolation also wasn't working, wasn't enough. So they banded together and they committed to sharing their data, what was and wasn't working, and set a goal to produce an additional 68,000 degrees over baseline projections over 10 years. And that founding group exceeded that target 3 years early in 2020, right with the class they graduated at the beginning of the pandemic. We produced almost 100,000 additional graduates over baseline. We're on track to double that initial goal by 2025. And that's been an increase of annual graduates of color by 85% since 2013, annual low-income graduates by 46%, and overall annual graduates by 30% since that baseline year. We expanded for the first time in 2021. We now are 13 institutions, soon to be 14. all in different states, representing the geography of the US and the diversity of students across the country. So our model is based on testing promising interventions. We'll talk about one on individual campuses, and then scaling what works across the alliance, diffusing what we learn to the sector so others can leverage what we've tested and learned. So this completion grants project, which we can advance to the next slide, thanks so much, is one of those projects. It was actually our third scale project, launched in 2017. And our goal was to address a shared problem across our network and many institutions, which was that we were losing students right before the finish line because they were running into, from our perspective, what was relatively small financial barriers that prevented them from registering for remaining classes pretty late in the game. So we heard examples that students were going to pretty extreme measures just to stay enrolled. They were doing everything from taking out more credit cards with high interest to extra jobs, donating plasma. On campus, we heard multiple examples. And of course, some students just stopped out a little short of a degree. So we scaled a model from Georgia State University that was designed to help students facing the drop for non-payment designation that I'm sure many are familiar with. So with support from Ascendium and Gates, we were able to provide almost 5,000 students across 11 institutions with grants that were an average of about $740, but no more than 1,000 over or less over 3 years. And we established a set of criteria that was consistent across all institutions. So in addition to showing an account balance that was 1,000 or less that impeded their registration, these students had to be senior standing. Hard to figure that out in some cases, but more on that later. Demonstrate a high level of financial need, specifically an estimated family contribution of 7,000. And they had to have a GPA of 2.0 or above, so in solid academic standing. And they had to have exhausted all available loans, which also became more complicated too. So beyond those parameters, we really deferred to campuses to develop the processes that they needed to identify who should receive these awards and to administer those awards. Some had grants in place for completion or retention, but many did not. And even if they did, they often used different criteria than what we had agreed upon across the network. So they developed working groups. Amelia talked about the collaboration that's involved, and that was absolutely the case, pulling together stakeholders who in some cases talked together about a lot of things, but not always about this, across the registrar's office, financial aid, advising, institutional research, depending on the design of each institution. And when we compared the outcomes of students receiving these grants to a population of other low-income seniors, we found that 70% of recipients were graduating within 3 terms. And that was a rate of 6% higher than those who hadn't received the awards. After 3 terms, 83% had graduated or were still enrolled, moving towards their degree. We can move to the next slide. So in the interest of time, I'll just share a few things we've learned from this project that are particularly applicable to emergency aid. This project obviously became very timely for us in 2020, and we were able to use the infrastructure that campuses had developed to be able to provide flexible emergency aid in partnership with several funders, including the ECMC Foundation. So the first is to think about how we can get out of students' ways. Our well-intentioned processes and policies as administrators can cause a lot of the problems we end up struggling to solve. And I don't think that's unique in higher ed, but it's very true for us. So students were stopping out because they couldn't come up with a couple $100s of fees that produced a hold that we placed on their account. And library fines probably not doing much for students or the institution. Parking fines, can students even find parking? At least they're trying to come to class and park. So, just look at it and ask the questions. I know funders are increasingly interested in these kinds of barriers, and that's wonderful. And so just really encourage you to encourage institutions to look under the hood at some of those well-intended, but perhaps detrimental policies. And then when you invest in emergency aid programs or completion or retention grant programs, just encouraging partners to think about the process from the student's perspective, how they learn about the awards, when they receive the awards, who's most likely to need them. Will they need to ask for help, which can be hard? Will advisors need to play a role in referring students, and can that be helpful? We found that award timing really varied by campus. Some needed to adjust it. They might have a couple of different drop deadlines, and maybe the first one was too early, so they would give students a little more time, or the later deadline meant that students had more time, and so they came up with more extreme measures to pay. And we didn't want them to do that, so we opted to then intervene earlier, just to be a little bit more conservative and catch students who maybe might have figured it out, but we didn't want them to go that route. We also found that transfer students need a lot more help. They'd often run out of other aid sources. And then what about students who are parents, caregivers? Some campuses have populations that were really debt averse, and so requirements that they use all loans were difficult. Some were really losing students after sophomore year, and senior year was too late because there might be a big financial aid cliff after the first couple of years. And for campuses with a lot of transfer students, it could be hard to know how close students were to graduation. So really focusing on completion grants got challenging, and maybe thinking more about retention grants provided a little bit more flexibility. So in sum, not every student or every campus is the same. And flexible funds and parameters really equip campuses to address the way these problems present for them. And I think finally, another thing we learned, really ask your partners what happens after students walk across the stage, or I guess it's the screen the last couple of years. Sometimes these fees, that were showing up on students' accounts, they would reappear and students couldn't access their transcript, which doesn't help anyone get a job. And that's probably why students went to college. So, really thinking critically about what happens, those fees might come back to get you later. I'm so grateful for the chance to talk with you today. I look forward to your questions, and thanks to my co-panelists for queuing up a great conversation as well.
Well, I want to thank Anna and Megan and our dear colleague Amelia for preparing some opening remarks to give us a sense of the work that they've been engaged in and how they have progressed. I was listening intently as they were sharing opening remarks, and it struck me that Megan indicated that there were critical conditions that allowed learning to happen early on for a modest investment, that there was some benefit from the partnership with Ascendium in the beginning work and the development of this work. I heard from Amelia that collaboration was essential in the success of their work and what they saw making a difference from their research on the efforts that were taking place. And I heard Anna indicate that it wasn't just the Gates and Ascendium support, but also the ECMC support that was developing momentum and providing some avenues for extending the work. So I want to thank our colleagues for just providing a wealth of good information for the funders on the call today to get a better sense on how retention grants, emergency grants, graduation grants, lots of different ways, completion grants, lots of different ways that we can articulate and frame this support for students in need that is timely, that is available, and that is responsive. I just want to applaud you for the work that you've done. In some ways, my job is to ask follow-up questions based on the information that was already shared. I want to take this moment to invite our colleagues on the line. If you have questions to put in the Q&A area, please feel free to do so. But my first question for Amelia, following up on the information you shared about how institutions need to collaborate more, could you say a little bit about how you have seen institutions be intentional in their delivery of emergency aid, or any recommendations you might have for institutions to become more intentional in their delivery of emergency aid? Any information there you might share?
Yeah, I can respond maybe in two ways, and thank you for all the kudos you gave us. But I also have to say it's indicative of a really great amount of work the campuses did too. So the real honor was being able to visit campuses and talk with them about what they've done. So in terms of intentionality, I can give you a really simple example, but I think it's one that reflects kind of where a campus is heading right now. So I feel happy that on the whole, since 6 years ago, many more campuses are doing this. So no longer do we see the question of, is emergency aid a real thing? And so I think one area of intentionality is that rather than focus on what to provide, is how to increase the impact of what they're providing. So a simple example would be the food pantry. So years before, it was, do we need one? Should we have one? How big should we make it? How do we design the bags? Where should we put it on campus? Things like that. Now they're having conversations about how to provide more healthy fruits and vegetables there, how to have it not be so much processed food. So some might look at that and say, well, weren't we expecting to some point not need a food pantry? I think the conversation has shifted to say, we probably will have to have a food pantry. And if we are, let's make it the best food pantry that we can possibly have. So one level of intentionality, I think, is just trying to make it the most optimal resource and remove this idea that if we have to have it, that it could be something of an afterthought, but instead something you think about in a proactive way. The second thing I would say is maybe in the area of assessment. Big question that comes up all the time. What is the impact of emergency aid for those students who get it? And so it's a very delicate conversation. You don't want to collect so much information so that you profile students in an inappropriate way. But I would say one underutilized area that I think is starting to come up to a more utilized area is qualitative data. We talk a lot about the outcome metrics and how you can tie that to whether students stay enrolled and things like that. But sometimes the best sources of process improvement is the actual conversation with students, where they would tell you, well, I had to go through 3 or 4 steps. That's not easily something that you would tease out of a survey, but instead a conversation. Again, handled delicately so as not to put the student in an uncomfortable position. But it could even be as simple as qualitative data collected from the administrators who deliver it, who will tell you about those really cumbersome policies that my colleague just mentioned. So I think 2 points there: the intentionality around making the offerings that we have available even better, and then the second is intentionally using various types of data, i.e. qualitative data, to get to the nuance of each situation.
You make keeping track of the recommendations very easy as you shared your perspectives on intentionality. So thank you for highlighting where you are seeing good movement and positive movement, and then reminding us around the intentionality of data collection, qualitative data collection, and the creativity around the ways that we provide support, hearing from students and allowing them to share what works best for them. I'd like to transition a bit to Anna, because in your remarks, and Anna, you shared that not only was Gates funding and Ascendium funding helpful, but you also mentioned ECMC funding. And I'm sure that with your work with the University Innovation Alliance, you are dealing with lots of funders around completion grants, around emergency aid. If there were any difficult elements that funders should avoid when they're deciding to invest in emergency aid efforts, or any landmines that funders should know to steer around, what would be some of the difficult elements or important elements that funders should consider when they are engaging in investments around emergency aid?
Sure, thanks, Tina. So I would say just a couple simple things. I mean, I think if you know, first of all, thanks for asking this. I would love to tell funders what's difficult to avoid. It would help grantees. So 2 things. I think if you have ever worked in financial aid, or if you know anybody who has, you know that people in those offices hear the most heart-wrenching stories and know the entire array of all the challenges and the experiences students can be navigating. So they're really aware of the needs much more than we are. So I would say, to avoid the mindset of thinking that we need to narrowly restrict what institutions can do, I would set clear goals and let the institutions be the experts in meeting them, because there are a lot of restrictions around the way, and rightfully so, around the way federal and state aid dollars can be used. And sometimes all institutions need to be able to solve the students' problems is more flexible resources. I'd also say to avoid anything that requires the same approach in every setting, just based on kind of what I shared previously. We took the same approach in every institution, but discovered they were all different in ways we didn't even know. We know them pretty well. Indiana and California have really strong need-based aid programs, and the ESC cutoff was really difficult because it turned out that UC Riverside and Purdue, the low-income students at those institutions were almost entirely covered, or were entirely covered. So it meant that the need was at a slightly higher level for lower middle income students than we'd allowed for. So there were conditions making it difficult for them to meet those parameters. So those would be my 2 recommendations.
Very, very helpful. And I see that folks are putting questions in the chat. I'm going to go to one more question that I had before we pivot to one of the chat questions. If you were, so I'm going to go to Mayin first and ask if you were to think about the next place of innovation around emergency aid, or based on where we are now, what would be the next horizon around emergency aid? I'm going to ask Mayin to share, and if Anna and Amelia have perspectives, what's around the corner when we think about the next place of innovation around emergency aid? Mayin?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, great question. I think that there's a couple implications from COVID that are maybe changing what my response would have been otherwise. I think with institutions having been able to ideally leverage their CARES Act money for emergency aid, there is now going to be a big question, and I see one of the participants put this in the chat around the funding for this work. I think that the case has been made. I'm hopeful for the impact that emergency aid grants can have, but I do think there's a next frontier around sustainability, as well as how this actually plays into the broader culture of care movement for institutions. That's going to be really important. So, how does applying for an emergency aid grant connect then a student to access to public benefits or, other basic needs? So like, how do we really build this not as a standalone intervention, but actually as a part of a coordinated care approach at institutions?
Any other feedback? Amelia?
Yeah.
Ooh, Amelia's having a thought.
I had a quick thought, really just to build on what Mayenta. I think the two things around the corner will be two things we're already doing, but maybe we'll see more in the future. One would be those external collaborations with local partners and resources that they can offer. So I think that will continue to increase. I think the second is probably some specific types of training. I think over the past few years, a lot of professionals that they became highly trained in COVID protocol and got to learn the nuances of how to handle a crisis and how to handle emergency. I don't know that I see a lot of campuses doing dedicated emergency aid training, but I do think as the types of emergencies continue to be varied, we'll see more professionals saying, actually, I would like to know a little bit more about this particular topic or that one, so that if a student comes to me in crisis, they don't have to actually refer them. They can in real time give them some resources and help them navigate that emergency as best they can. So I think the area of training would be a second one.
And I would just add, maybe zooming out a little bit, we're realizing at the UIA that helping students stay enrolled amidst emergencies is only part of the challenge. So those students may stay enrolled, which is a goal, but they need extra help to get back on track or stay on track because they were struggling to balance caring for family or losing their job or many other challenges that disproportionate effects by race and income that we're struggling to support. So we're focusing now on how institutions can help provide additional academic support to students who have struggled over the last couple of years. Of course, this is something that they should do and continue to do post-pandemic, a future that we hope to someday reach. But looking in particular at students who have withdrawn from or failed key courses that they need to progress and providing extra course sections, supplemental instruction, peer coaching to help them succeed. Because we need to ensure that the emergency aid helps them stay enrolled, but that they don't just stay enrolled, they can then graduate with additional support.
Thank you all for sharing what you're seeing coming around the corner and thinking through where we've been the last 2 years and where we might need to lean in more intentionally in this next phase of emergency aid. I really appreciated the concept of culture of care that Mayen shared in her remarks, thinking about the ways that we wrap our arms around the learner wherever they are and all of the different elements, not just their academic progress, but also their life experiences and how we can be a partner along that journey. So thank you so much for sharing. I saw that in the chat, one of our colleagues asked questions about unique ways of funding and any institutions that are being creative about their emergency aid allocations and so forth. And I know that we have St. John's University lifted up in the chat as a campus that is engaged in, I think we're seeing alumni giving as a strategy for supporting their aid. And then I know that the CARES Act dollars has been lifted up as another resource that institutions are leaning into. I want to pause here because for those who will be listening to this recording after the fact, if there's anything that our panelists would like to say about St. John's University or about CARES Act resources or other ways that specific institutions are being creative in their funding strategies, I want to give you an opportunity to share vocally what we've put in the chat.
Well, I put St. John's out there and I should have no favorites, but I brag on them often because in the early discussions of emergency aid, they were talking about how their location in New York City gives them a lot of different types of conversations to be having with students, those who live on campus, but also need to navigate the city. And so I highlight them a lot because they oftentimes talk about how they started with a small effort, and with the right communication of the impact of those efforts, they were able to grow into something that's much more sustainable. So I don't have exact dollars, but we're talking 6-figure investment from the campus saying, now we know that we want to invest in this. And then that also connects to alumni giving. So they're not that special. in the sense that there aren't 1,000, reasons why I would want to name somebody else, but they were the first ones that came to mind. And I think they did the most proactive work of any campus I've seen in terms of truly pulling back the curtain and saying, no, this is something that we actually do. Then they get to show with data that it actually was effective, and then they get to use that to solicit additional funding from alums and others who want to give. So they are one among a larger constellation of several bright shining stars across the country.
Thank you, Amelia. Any other bright stars that we might want to lift up for the benefit of funders on the call?
I would offer, I think the Hope Center published a recent report that includes some case studies. And so I'll try to find the exact link, but that might be another source. I saw someone post share more, and I think I assume it was about the wanting some more example institutions. And so that would be just another resource I would recommend to find some of those.
Can I also just add this too, in the spirit of collaboration and shout outs, I don't want to turn into the shout out hour, but I do want to acknowledge that even before NASPA got into the work and some of the later discussions, there were organizations that were doing this work well before us. So I know MDRC, even earlier, I want to say back in like 2008, looked at this and the impact at tribal colleges and universities, maybe even community colleges, and some of the same themes around communication and collaboration, ring true. So along with, the Hope Center and UNCF, there have been a lot of organizations that have been involved in this discussion. I think we've been better for it in the sense that we get to learn along the way. So similar to what colleagues have said, I think this community of practice is not just something that campuses are a part of, but I think the community practice that includes funders too is really beneficial for how we could keep this going at scale.
And I'll just add one because I feel like I have to now. But we had, if it's helpful to have a campus level perspective directly, we had a research team at Michigan State University that did a mixed method study looking at their completion grants work. And they both talked to students directly about the experience and value, and they looked at the statistical significance of receiving those grants, which we didn't actually do at our RCT for the overall study because we didn't feel great about the ethics of not choosing some students. But they had enough students that they could do that. Who met the parameters. So I can put a link in the chat, but it was interesting to see how they looked at their specific population and heard the value and design that was most helpful.
Well, I am excited because one, we are sharing the wealth of lots of organizations that are committed to this work, not just the University Innovation Alliance, not just NASPA, not just Gates, but lifting up Ascendium and ECMC as two other organizations that have invested, lifting up the work of MDRC as a great research organization that had plowed the ground early around tribal institutions, lifting up, of course, UNCF's work in this space, and the Hope Center that recently came out with a report. There's lots of information being shared on this webinar for funders that are new to the space of emergency aid to know that there's lots of really great spaces where you can anchor your future work, and to know that you are entering a community of many players that are committed to student success and the value of emergency aid, of completion grants, of right now real-time, on-time support for students who are in financial need. So the last question that I had for the group is more around what could funders do that they haven't already done. So if there is something that you would recommend a funder to do, Anna was very helpful in identifying landmines or places where funders should be very thoughtful, particularly around listening to the institutions and making sure that there's lots of flexibility in the dollars so that we are meeting the students' needs where they are by not putting arbitrary stipulations around how emergency aid is developed and structured and delivered. So that was one recommendation that I heard very clear, Anna. But if there is something that you definitely want to see funders invest in, if there's one or two suggestions you might have, this would be a great time for you to share.
Well, I see a related question in the Q&A that I might add And one additional example that I might connect to, I think, the flexibility and resources is especially important when the support that we received from ECMC around emergency aid was totally unrestricted. And at that time, you could not allocate federal CARES Act funds to DACA and undocumented students. And so that was critical that we were able to say, you can support students who need this, without worrying about, qualifications like that. So that was really important. I also see a question in here about collaborations in emergency aid work and the role small foundations might play. I would say use kind of the matching potential and maybe the matching leverage potential to say, even to go to an institution and say, we'd love to support this. How can, might you raise this? We'll match it dollar for dollar, or these are the portions that we might share, such as Gates and Ascendium work together to support the pieces that fit within their funding strategies. I think that could help build a relationship with that funder and that institution over time in a regional partnership, and could help the institution kind of start to take ownership of raising resources in this area.
Yeah, Tina, it sounded like you said, what's on my wish list? And I have so many things. I can probably put it into areas and I'd say any of these would be helpful. So just to pick up on the previous comment, and even someone put this in the chat already, something that would connect higher ed to other industries, and specifically health and wellness, health and human services, anything that could happen to be an intentional collaboration where the same issues we're talking about that happen to affect students on the campus, that doesn't just leave when they go home, even if they live someplace else. So I think any investment that could promote a local campus partnership, I'd like to see that type of thing go scale. And then something around state policy, and even maybe policy around financial aid. Not to say that there's a lot to be fixed or changed, but I just think that having the impact of a funder community, talking about some of the nuanced policies that maybe hamstring us a little bit, I think that would probably be very, very helpful. I give you this in the context of the well-intentioned professional who does not want to be the person who says no to a student, but they're only doing it for compliance purposes. And it's a hard line to draw there. I think more discussion and unpacking the nuance of how policies impact what we're doing. So all the points Anna just made on that one. But if I had to double down somewhere, it would be that local campus partnership and maybe even outside higher ed, right there in local workforce and public health agencies as well.
Mm-hmm.
Excellent.
Yeah, I'd love to pile on to that and the comment about the state level collaborations and expansion. I think we're all probably pretty concerned about, all right, coming out of the pandemic with CARES Act, funding ending, and just in general, like, what is that return to normal or whatever normal is going to look like mean? Our institution, are we going to kind of revert back to old ways of doing things, or does some of what we've been able and institutions have been able to put in place from the momentum and the need to really make some quick shifts on policy or how they're leveraging funding to direct it to students through emergency aid? How do we make the case for that to hold on? And I think it's going to require looking more regionally or at that state level for those opportunities for collaboration. So that tri-agency work that someone posted that they're seeing, I think is really exciting and an area that I think we need to be putting some more focus as we move into this kind of, what does it look like to take what's really been good about the new supports and ways for institutions to be supporting students and embed that into their everyday way of doing things.
Well, I have noticed that the Q&A box is buzzing right now, and we're running low on time. So I'm going to ask one question from the Q&A box. And because I know that all three of you are collaborative individuals and colleagues, if folks want to reach out to you individually, I would hope that you would be open to that. And we can connect any funder on the line with any one of our panelists for that deep dive. But one individual on the line asked, are we seeing any strategies to avoid implicit bias in the work, however that might show up? And are there any ed tech solutions that are helping some emergency aid programs move with greater strength, efficiency, effectiveness? So are there any ed tech solutions that folks should know about? And are there any strategies around implicit bias? I know that's a lot. So anything that you might have heard or experienced or learned over the years in those two arenas would be great places to lean in.
I'll take the second part, and maybe my colleagues can pick up the rear. I think in terms of how to, I don't think you could actually avoid all bias, but I think the place where it's fertile ground for it to happen, and we hope that we can eliminate that, is when you're trying to determine which students should get limited resources. And it's fertile ground for miscommunication or assumptions and implicit bias about what the profile of a student who needs help with an emergency might be. And so I think that's probably something that the technology can't really fix. At some point, someone's going to be leveraging that technology to actually disperse the aid. But if the very first conversation doesn't take us past the point of saying, are they really experiencing an emergency? Well, you know that most people who ask for this type of help look like this or have these types of experiences. That's right there. That full stop. I'd say that's probably a strategic communication effort for the campus to, again, normalize this conversation to a point where if you do see those types of things coming out, even if someone brings some data there, to try to move us past that the idea of a single profile of someone who experiences emergency is there, but instead all of us, have probably been in that situation. So how we do that with tech, I'm gonna go on mute and hope that one of my colleagues has a better answer on that one.
So I really appreciate that question about implicit bias, because I think that is one of the big gaps in this space, is actually needing to do more work and supporting institutions to understand who is utilizing emergency aid, how, why, and who, most importantly, who is not, and how and why. In terms of, I don't have an ed tech solution for the implicit bias piece, but in terms of streamlining, because we know one of the biggest issues is that I think the latest data was it's taking on average 12 days to get a student the money. That's an average. So doesn't mean that it's people that's taking even longer. That's too long if it's an emergency. I mean, they need it. So that idea of efficiency, I think, is another really important space for us to be looking at technology. We've done some work with Edquity, and they had an RCT you might have seen with Compton College, showed some really good results. But at the end of the day, a lot of that efficiency piece is actually institutional rigidity around policies and procedures. So now technology can help that, right? It can help push them to adopt different policies and procedures, but I think we have to, recognize, like, how can we support the institutional redesign part of that? And then there was one other that I now am blanking on. So let me turn over to Tina. I'll put it in the chat. Remember.
No worries. Now, before I go to my last opportunity for each panelist to share one thing that you'd like funders to do. We have funders that have come to today's session, funders that are going to listen to today's session later on. And if there was one thing that you want a funder to do as a result, a participant to do as a result of today's conversation, I'd like us to end there, and then I'll have some closing comments about the PSA2 group for our participants on the line. So I don't have a prescribed list of who's going to go first. It's whoever wants to jump in.
I'd say to take time to listen directly to students as much as you can. I think it's easy, even at an intermediary level, to get removed from those stories. And it is easy to see the complexity when you hear them directly, and easy to see the importance of flexible support and to connect with why you're providing that support. So I would just say create opportunities to listen directly.
I think in that same theme of communication, I would say use the megaphone. And I hate to put it in the context of when a funder calls, people answer the phone. And so I say leverage that influence that you have, even if you're not looking to make a direct investment in emergency aid yourself. If you know there's other good work happening, I would suggest that you find a way to showcase that, spread the word a little bit. So I think every opportunity to do so will probably ultimately impact a student in the ways that we just described.
I would say I really think that the partnership with the grantees, and in this case with Amelia and Anna, is so critical. And we sit so far away from the field, and so I agree with Anna about listening to students and and all of that, but also really trying to empower the grantees with that flexibility to really be the ones to drive the change, and the direction is important. And I'm saying that from someone who works at a foundation for whom that is very hard. So I guess it's a challenge to myself and also to everyone else here about how do we create the type of flexible funding that actually will enable the type of change for students that we know is possible.
I want to thank each one of you. I heard that we should listen to students, that we should use the megaphone that is available to the funders on the call to share the good news and spread the word about the value of this work. And I heard that partnering with your grantees, learning together, collaborating, and being flexible to change when we need to as funders in this space are three things that our great panelists are leaving with us. I want to thank Dr. May Yin Ireland and Dr. Amelia Parnell and Dr. Anna Drake Warshaw for joining us today and sharing their insights around emergency aid, around completion grants, and around ways that funders can make a difference in this space. Thank you to the individuals who joined on today's conversation. It has been a pleasure to engage with you for the many ways that you were active in the chat and in the Q&A box. I want to thank our colleagues who are leading the Postsecondary Access and Attainment group as part of GFE, both Leslie Garola and Sue Choi, who are currently our coordinators and chair people for the PSA2 group. Please know that this is a time when GFE has a lot of great programming going on, and I believe my colleague is going to put up a page for folks to see all of the great programming that GFE has on the docket that is coming up. We want to make sure that you don't miss out on participating in other GFE activities. Of course, the conference is coming up in October of this year, and we hope that you will join us. The PSA2 group always finds a way to get together and share information and grow professionally and create networks with each other. So please make it a point to check out the PSA2 activities that will be taking place at the October meeting for GFE. And please know that we, as part of GFE, always record these webinars. So if you know of a colleague who wasn't able to join today's session, please know that as a participant, you will receive a link in about a week that is the recording of today's session, so that you can share it with others. Please make sure to share the good information that Anna and May Yen and Amelia shared with us today. And I want to thank all of my colleagues who are on the line. This has been a rich conversation, a time well spent, and we look forward to staying engaged and seeing everyone in October. Don't miss out.